Out of all the characters in Marvel's library, Spider-Man certainly has the best selection of villains. Time and again, writers and artists have been able to call upon the likes of Green Goblin, Mysterio, and Venom to torment the Warcrawler through various different means. But perhaps the most storied antagonist is Dr. Otto Octavius, Dr. Octopus. Doc Ock has been battling wits with Spider-Man pretty much since the hero was first introduced, and it's been often the case that what drives him, a fierce rivalry with the web slinger, as well as a somewhat unspoken respect for him, has resulted in the pair's confrontations getting more and more serious with each encounter. Sure, the likes of Venom and even Green Goblin may hate everyone's friendly neighborhood web slinger, but they are both victims of their own lack of imagination. Octavius, on the other hand, is as close to an evil genius as you can get, and vows to outdo himself with each and every battle he and the Warcrawler partake in. This has resulted in some truly egregious acts over the years, and though none were quite as destructive as the Goblin orchestrated clone saga, at least in terms of sparing my eyes, but most, if not all, were certainly more compelling. If nothing else though, these acts prove one thing. The Warcrawler may have plenty of great bad guys, but Ock is by far the best. So, I'm Ewan, this is What Culture Comics, and here are the 8 worst things Doc Ock has ever done to Spider-Man. Number 8, he tried to marry Aunt May. One of the most enduring elements about the rivalry between Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus is that Octavius is sort of the antithesis of Peter. They find common ground in the fact that they were both social outcasts gifted with intelligence, but whereas Peter uses that gift to do good, Otto does the exact opposite, latching onto his resentment and using his smarts to take revenge on those who wronged him. I mean, it's a bit pathetic to be honest. Otto could have been using his 4 large arms to pluck fruit from trees, or even save cats, or to massage 2 people at once, or even operate on people and, you know, save lives. Whatever. Ock's own maliciousness has manifested under various guises over the years, but perhaps the most unusual one came when Ock tried to marry May Parker, Peter's beloved aunt. Why was Ock so infatuated with the idea? Well, it turns out that May had actually inherited an entire island off the coast of Canada. Jesus Christ, May, which also happened to house one of the richest supplies of uranium found in nature, as well as its own nuclear plant. Radioactive isotopes and supervillains go together like Andy Murray and sheer unadulterated banter, so it's not too difficult to think of what Ock had in mind. What he had in mind, though, probably came a lot sooner than expected, as an unsuspecting charge from Hammerhead results in a nuclear meltdown, seemingly killing both Ock and his steely-headed rival. Number 7. Everything he did in Spider-Man PS4. Now, this may technically not be a comic book moment in the most literal sense, but how could anyone possibly ignore the climax to Insomniac Games' Spider-Man? Also, gonna just go ahead and slap a big old spoiler warning on this if you haven't played, and well, if you haven't, you should really go fix that now. It's great. Anyway, Insomniac opted to fashion a universe of their own when bringing the Warcrawler to current-gen systems, and it worked a treat. They told a brand new Spidey story, replete with commentary on how Peter Parker has grown up over the years, and wrapped it up with a neat little devastating blow that left gamers reaching for the nearest box of tissues, and me doing my best Rutger Hauer impression from flipping Blade Runner. What Insomniac Games did so well, at least as far as storytelling is concerned, is that it tapped into the tragedy of Otto Octavius' fall. Much like in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2, the studio opted to weave Peter's story directly into Otto's origins, going to great lengths to illustrate Spidey's admiration for Octavius, as well as his ignorance and failing to alert to his mentor's mental decline. This is what makes Otto's inevitable downfall so downright heartbreaking, as players are left powerless to avert disaster. Unfortunately for everyone else, when Ock does take on his new villainous persona, he unleashes a devastating bioweapon on NYC that leaves thousands dead, including Aunt May. It was a moment no one saw coming, and easily made for one of Otto's most egregious offenses to date. Number 6, he nearly blew up New York City in his first appearance. The original Stan Lee Steve Ditko Spider-Man stories are some of the greatest comics the web-slinger has ever appeared in, and one of the best issues, unsurprisingly, came from Doc Ock's first appearance. In his initial introduction, not only does Doc Ock take an entire hospital hostage, Taking on the moniker he'd been insulted with while experimenting with his 4 mechanical arms, he swats Spider-Man aside with ease, even picking him up and slapping him across the face in the ultimate expression of BDE, that side of 1962. The offense proves so great that Spidey then considers hanging up his tights for good, leaving it to the Human Torch to convince him to keep going. In the meantime, Ock took control of a nuclear facility, leaving the Warcrawler to regather his strength and defeat him with a swift punch to the jaw. Number 5, he made Peter lose his memories. Back during one of their earlier encounters, Dr. Octopus actually managed to turn his most hated adversary into a temporary ally. With Spider-Man being a friendly neighborhood sort of guy, it's pretty clear that this was a particularly nasty offense to commit, a fact only exacerbated through the way in which Ock manages to control the hero. In The Amazing Spider-Man number 55, Doc Ock manages to control the web slinger by effectively turning him into an amnesiac. With a blank slate to work with, Ock convinces his former adversary into becoming his greatest accomplice, causing Peter no end of inconvenience both in his civilian identity and as Spider-Man 2. Of course, Peter manages to break free in the end, but for a good period of time, he was considered Octavius' key accomplice. Had Ock prevailed, then J. Jonah Jameson really would have gotten his one wish, that Spider-Man is a public menace. And speaking of JJ, number 4, he unmasked Spider-Man without realizing it. Although with great intellect comes great ego isn't nearly half as immortal as Uncle Ben's musings on power and responsibility, in Octavius' case, it probably should be. Years before he would effectively kill Parker by swapping bodies, Octavius actually unmasked him in front of all his peers. Unfortunately for the 8-legged villain, he was too arrogant to see that Parker was actually Spider-Man, decrying the freelance photographer as a weakling brat. Words hurt, man. And deducing that the real Spider-Man must have used him as bait. Fortunately for Peter, his colleagues at the Daily Bugle remain none the wiser. Betty Brant thinks that he's donned Spidey's tights as a means of saving her, while Jonah deems his antics to have been reckless. The thought of him actually being Spider-Man never crosses their minds, and had Otto only been just a smidge more diligent, he would have learned his adversary's secret far sooner. Number 3, he played a role in Captain Stacy's death. The Stacy family have been given something of a rotten deal in Marvel's comic books. Everyone knows of Gwen Stacy, Peter's first true love who died at the hands of Green Goblin, but it's also worth remembering that her father, Captain George Stacy, perished before she did. Although the Green Goblin played a huge role in Gwen's death, it was Doc Ock who had a hand in George's. The key difference here, though, is that Ock never actually planned to kill Stacy. Instead, while Ock and Spidey are fighting on a rooftop, the pair manage to send debris tumbling down to the streets below. Captain Stacy, busy trying to get people to safety, is crushed by the falling concrete, leaving Spidey to grieve, and Ock with a neat little bonus. What made this particular death so heart-wrenching is the fact it comes pretty much out of nothing. Ock and the Warcrawler are sparring like they usually do, trading insults and diatribes until George suddenly kicks the bucket. Ultimately, his death serves as a harsh reminder of what's at stake for Spidey, and how even though he can try to save everyone, actually doing so isn't really all that easy. Number 2, he almost killed Black Cat. By now, you've probably gathered that Dr. Octopus is a bit full of himself, and you'd be right. The villain reveres himself so much that he has only rarely dabbled in alliances, and when he has, he's usually the reason they fall apart. So, with that in mind, it's perhaps understandable that he comes to blows with his other villains as often as he does with Spider-Man himself. The most famous occasion where this happened came in the Owl-Octopus War, where Otto fended off against frequent Daredevil villain the Owl in order to acquire a WMD. During this story arc, Black Cat and Spider-Man were something of an item, and the former actually assisted the latter in his attempts to quell the ensuing gang conflict. Tragically, after Spidey rips Octavius' tentacles right from his body, Cat is ensnared and fired upon by his thugs. The Warcrawler rushes her to hospital as she bleeds out, and is left to agonize as to her fate until much later in the story. Number 1, he swapped bodies with Peter and left him to die. Although this scheme did eventually lead to Ock's own redemption, few would have considered that it was possible at the time. Dan Slott presided over a somewhat tumultuous time for the Wallcrawler, but things couldn't have gone any more horrific than they did when Ock successfully managed to swap bodies with Peter Parker and left his greatest rival to die in his disease-riddled cadaver. In terms of imagery, I really cannot overstate how grim these panels were. Like, it's up there with Sandman loading Peter full of sand until he descended and exploded. Or even when Sandman was killed by Venom, the two most haunting Spider-Man moments of my childhood. Point being, it was brutal, and somehow felt almost too cruel for Ock, who had nothing but the utmost respect for his adversary over the years. But it happened. He won. Or so, that's what fans thought. In a final twist, it is revealed that Peter managed to impart some final words of advice to his villain, begging him to use his newfound power responsibly, even as he initially intended to use Parker's body for evil. Eventually, this would lead into the Superior Spider-Man series, where Ock vowed to be a new and improved version of the web-slinger, and to become a better hero than Peter ever could. See, told you it had a happy-ish ending.